Hello. I came to know Michel Chodkiewicz when I was teaching and in Paris in the 1980s. And in the end, we were meeting almost weekly throughout most of the 1980s. So what I say here is mostly about my direct knowledge at that time. I would have to say that perhaps of all the scholars and teachers I've ever known, he's the one who most completely embodies the ideal of ihsan, sort of the definition of the culmination of religion in doing what is good and beautiful in sort of everything that he took up and touched. And as is true of most cases of ihsan, most of what he accomplished was done behind the scenes, not in the public eye. Certainly in the public eye of people who knew him and knew what he was doing, but his books are only kind of the tip of the iceberg of his influences more widely in France and all over the world. So the first thing, I have about 6 points I want to mention. First of all, most people wouldn't know this, but he was a trusted advisor for many years, perhaps decades, for the French government and the foreign ministry whenever anything came up that involved any part of the Muslim world. They knew that they could find a wise and well-informed and judicious perspective for almost anything that came up in this regard. So behind the scenes, he had a tremendous influence on governments of the right and of the left. In this point, when I was there, it was a socialist. But I remember especially his reactions to certain persecutions of Muslim groups in Syria and then later on in Turkish-speaking groups in Bulgaria. Just mentioning those as examples of what he was constantly doing behind the scenes. The second thing that I should mention is throughout this time, he was head of Éditions de Seuil, a complex body of publishing houses, which is the second largest in France and probably the most important in terms of academic and scholarly publishing. So there was literally, I think, no one in the Francophone world, and often important authors from other parts of the world, who wrote about Islam or the Muslim world at any period in any field, whose writings were not in some way touched and often selected and guided and edited by Michel Chodkiewicz. This tremendous influence and help was one of the reasons why French scholarship in Islam has continued to stand out above that of almost all other European countries, apart from the UK, put together. The third thing was, as I knew him as a professor at the École Pratique des Hautes Études, a high-level graduate famous graduate center where he taught in Paris, where he taught Islamic studies. And his students, dozens and dozens of them, came from all regions of at least the Francophone Muslim world, North Africa, West Africa, Lebanon, and Syria. And there he supported the vocations individually, and as the students went on to become professors and officials, he supported them throughout their lives, and really helped form a whole generation, a long generation of younger Muslim scholars from the countries of the Maghreb and West Africa. And that influence obviously continues in all those countries where they went back and now are teaching teachers, long-standing teachers themselves. The fourth point I wanted to mention was his pioneering book on the teachings of Abdul Qadir al-Jazari, the famous leader in Algeria of the French resistance to the French invasion in the 1830s, and then less famous but no less importantly in world history, the editor of Ibn Arabi's Futuhat, and someone who for many decades in Syria sort of supported a deeper understanding of Islam and Sufism that whose fruits, since in particular his edition of the Futuhat, is the one that's still largely used in most of the world by scholars. So Abdul Qadir was, I think, particularly important and illustrating what he was doing in his seminar in showing that the influence of Ibn Arabi and of the Sufism associated with him continued throughout now close to 1,000 years in the, so I guess one could say that, throughout the Muslim world. And Abdul Qadir was just one of the most famous and most influential of those figures who, from again, West Africa all the way across to Indonesia, continued to bring Ibn Arabi's ideas to the understanding and teaching of Islam and of the ulama, the religious and the religious sciences throughout those Muslim countries. So this was the kind of thing that he taught, particularly in his seminars at the École Pratique. Chodkiewicz's book, The Seal of the Saints, Le Sceau des Saints, was at least equally important. Now we're getting into real scholarship, but at least equally important in helping to understand and bring to the fore the ongoing importance of Wilaya, of the sort of instruments of God's friends, those individuals who continue to inspire and bring life to the religion of Islam. So it wasn't just a book about Ibn Arabi, but it was really had this much wider effect of turning our attention to these figures who, throughout Islamic history, have continued to form and shape popular devotional life, and in ways that were very adapted to the local conditions and languages of every region of the Muslim world. And finally, again, regarding his books, what he did in regard to Ibn Arabi, the study of Ibn Arabi in particular, was his constant emphasis on the role of the Quran and Hadith in his writings, and in, therefore, through them, in Sufism in all of its dimensions more widely. Really set the stages and the foundations for the intellectual, religious, and spiritual resources that any Muslim anywhere has to turn to in order to productively and lastingly combat or supplant or overcome the very appealing dualistic ideologies that we're all familiar with in their many forms of Islamism today. So anyone pretty much anywhere in the world who wants to go back to those deeper roots of the Quran and Hadith and the way that they really can be adapted and understood in part of the globalizing and rapidly changing world we live in today has to turn to Ibn Arabi and to other figures inspired by him in order to really understand the Quran and Hadith in ways that can be fruitful and productive and influential in the world we live in today.